joining us for our second event of the semester. My name is Sahid. I'm the president here at the Rutgers Hindutva chapter. Today we will have our guest speaker, Aditi Banerjee. So before she starts, I'll just give a little introduction. Aditi Ji's first novel, The Curse of Gandhari, a successful bestseller, was published by Bloomsbury, India in September 2019. Her second novel, On Shiva and Sati, has been slated for publication in 2022, also by Bloomsdale, India. She is a practicing attorney of Fortune 500 Financial Services at Columbia University. She has earned a Juris Doctor from Yale's Law School and received a BA in International Relations, magna cum laude from Tufts University. She is a prolific writer and speaker about Hinduism and the Indo-American experience. She is a member of the Indic Academy and Indic Book Club, which sponsored a successful 6-city book tour for The Curse of Gandhari in September 2019 across India. She co-edited the book Invading the Sacred, an analysis of Hinduism studies in America in collaboration with Rajiv Malhotra, and she authored several essays and publications such as The Columbia Directory, History of Religion in America since 1945, and Buddhist Hindus and Sikhs in America, a short story. Her articles have been published in Outlook India and many other publications. In her free time, she enjoys wandering the Himalayas, cooking with the latest kitchen gadgets, and hunting for the perfect cup of coffee, and reading about history and world literature. So without further ado,
Thank you, Sahid, and thank you for having me here. Namaste. So I'm really excited to be here tonight. For one thing, I've been working from home, so it's always nice to get out. It's nice being on campus. I finished my EMBA last May, so it's nice being on campus and seeing all of you. And then this is a topic that is very close to my heart. One of the first talks I gave when I was in college was about the need for a Hindu-American identity. So this theme of Hinduism, Hindutva, Hinduphobia is very close to my heart. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to say today, I didn't just want to come and share my personal views, because that's something you can read on Facebook, or I could write something and you could read it. But what I really want is for you and for me and for our community is to have a platform and a space where we can define for ourselves what Hinduism is, what it means to be Hindu, and what our role as Hindus is today. And having the freedom to do that, the platform to do that, and the wherewithal to do that. And that's really what I wanted to push for today. And there are two aspects to that project or that initiative or that work. One is external, which is making sure that Hindus have a place at the table, especially when Hinduism is being discussed or things like Hindutva are being discussed. It also means that we have the freedom to explore our identity and our heritage without interference, without bias, and without a lot of the baggage that comes with this today. And so that's the external part of it. And then the internal part of it is a process we all have to go through of deconditioning, which is that all around us we are fed information about what Hinduism is, who we are, and we have to go through this process of really thinking for ourselves and being critical thinkers, and learning to understand when someone is speaking, what they're saying, the history that comes behind that, even the language that we use. And I'm going to spend a lot of time today talking about language and terms, because that's very important. And so once the external space is there, we also have to do the hard work of asking difficult questions and really learning to think for ourselves. And I think as students, that's exactly what the student life is meant to do. That's what we're meant to do on campus, what we're meant to do in colleges. And I don't think we've had the ability to do that as much as we should have as Hindus. So that's really kind of the objective, and that I think we should be pushing for. And then, as I am a lawyer, I spend a lot of time thinking about terms and definitions of terms, and it's really hard to have a discussion about Hinduism or Hindutva without spending some time to actually talk about what these words mean and have come to mean. So what are people talking about when they talk about Hinduism and Hindutva? And I wanted to spend the first part of the talk really just unpacking that. And so there are three terms I want to go through. The first is just Hinduism, the second is Hinduphobia, and then the third is Hindutva. And then after that, I want to talk about the question, which is the theme of the talk, which is, can you separate Hinduism from Hindutva, and can Hinduism survive without Hindutva? So if you start with just Hinduism, the question would be, does Hinduism exist? And this is a really weird question to be asking. And yet, I'm sure you've heard this, where people say, well, Hinduism didn't really exist. It was kind of created by the British, or it only came to be when other religions were there and we had to come up with something, and it's kind of this artificial invention, and it doesn't have this cohesive, continuous history to it. The other thing you may have found is if someone asks you, what do Hindus believe in, it's really difficult to answer. There are other religions. If you're a Muslim, if you're a Christian, if you're a Jew, if you're a Buddhist, you can point to 4 or 5 tenets. It's very clear, you know that from day one, and in 30 seconds you can give an overview of that. The reason it's really difficult to understand what Hinduism is because we are different from other religions. Hinduism is probably the only existing indigenous tradition, non-Abrahamic, non-organized religion that is still alive today. And it's very hard to distill or to convey Hinduism when our language and our mental frameworks are totally rooted in something else. And so it's hard to even say what do Hindus believe in, because first of all, we're not a religion about believing, we're a tradition of seeking. And we're not starting with something where you have a dogma or a doctrine. In fact, any belief that you have, you're meant to transcend. But I think it is helpful when we go into this to lay out a few of the core concepts and core elements of Hindu dharma. And there can be a lot of quibbling about the exact terminology. Is it Hinduism? Is it Sanatana Dharma? Is it Hindu dharma? But I think it's, for practicality, it's helpful just to think about Hinduism, and that's the syntax where we're talking in today. So the first part of being a Hindu or Hinduism is following the Vedas and accepting the Vedas for what they are. And again, when we say the Vedas, sometimes people think that means it's like our Bible. It's not exactly that. It's many of us, or many Hindus, never even read a word of the Vedas. But it is this shraddha, or this honoring of the Vedas as being aparishaya, not being of human creation, of being shruti, that which is heard and revealed to us through direct hearing or direct transmission, and something that is swata pramana, or it is itself a pramana, meaning if it's in the Vedas, that is truth to us. And even if we do not read the Vedas, or we're not familiar with the Vedas, whatever tradition that we follow, whether it comes from like the Guru or different traditions, it owes its allegiance and its fidelity to the Vedas. It starts from the Vedas. So in that way, we're still a very Vedic tradition. And our practices are also rooted in the Vedas. So for example, if you think of our devatas, like you can have Krishna and Rama and Shiva, and they may have had slightly different names or slightly different imagery in the Vedas, but it's this very still same Vedic pantheon that comes to us today. And even our practices, so for example, in the Vedas, fire sacrifice and yajna is really important. Even though we may not do those same rites today, but everything that we do, for example, lighting a diya or worshiping images of our devatas, comes again from that idea of yajna and upasana. The second really important part is what we call rhythm or dharma, and that's this idea that there's a cosmic order and then a balance that we have to uphold. And dharma is that upholding that balance or that order. And the reason this becomes really important is later when we talk about Hindutva and this idea that Hinduism may be something just mystical in the inner spiritual experience. and that it's about escapism is not really correct, because dharma means you care about what's happening in the phenomenal world. It means there are duties and responsibilities and a vision of how the world should be. And then when you have dharma, there are also sources of dharma. How do you know what dharma is? So it comes from the Shruti, which is the Vedas, the Smriti, which is the Dharma Shastras, the Itihasa, like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the Puranas, and also what they call sadachara, or the conduct of people who are considered to be noble. And finally, the Atma Tushti, or the satisfaction of one's inner self. So from this, we know what dharma is. And then part of the Smriti is also this idea of sampradaya and parampara, where you have traditions and you have transmission over time. And you'll find in all of our major traditions, if you go to like a guru or a temple or a different organization, they often will trace back their parampara to Brahma. So this idea of having continuity. So a lot of times you hear about there is Vedic Hinduism, and now modern Hinduism is a new creation, and it's an interpolation. But actually this continuity was very important all throughout. And then there's also something I want to mention, which is the Pancha Mahayagya, or this idea that every human being comes into the world with 5 different duties that have to be performed on a daily basis. So it's yajna to the devas, yajna to the rishis, and that tradition of our rishis and acharyas, yajna to our pitras, or our ancestors, manushya yajna, which is to our fellow human beings and to care for those who are in bad circumstances, and then bhuta yajna, which is for the animals, the insects, the birds, the invisible beings of the world. And so I mentioned the idea of parampara, this continuity and cohesiveness, and then the other part of this is what I'd call the sacred geography. So whatever it may have been called, even if the word Hinduism wasn't used, the idea of the 4 corners of Bharat and our centers of pilgrimage and all of this was really important. So for example, when Adi Shankara was here and he established the 4 mathas at the different ends of India, this idea that whether you're in the north or the south, the east or the west, our practices and customs may have been different, but there was one underlying ethos and worldview has been there for thousands of years. This is not a new thing. It's not a modern nation-building phenomenon. So what Hinduism is not it's not made up. It's not something that's artificial. It's not just primitive superstition. It's not something that was just cobbled together by taking pieces and bits from different religions. It is also not just New Age spirituality, and it is not just escapism. It's intensely concerned with what's happening in the real world and what's happening without us. And even Adi Shankara, even the highest of Vedantins say that the world still has transactional validity, and we have to deal with it as it is. And this is really important because a lot of times we hear Hinduism reduced to just being kind of like a buffet of whatever you want to believe, whatever you want to do, and it's not this loosey-goosey thing. So that is on Hinduism. And then I want to talk about Hinduphobia. And again, there's a sense of, well, is Hinduphobia real? Does it exist? What does it mean? Is it just this made-up thing? And so there can be, again, quibbling over terms, whether Hinduphobia is the correct term or should be something else like Hindunesia or something. But let's just, for simplicity, take the term Hinduphobia. And what we mean by that is a set of, and there's a website, there was a conference recently that sought to define this more rigorously, but basically a set of antagonistic, derogatory, and destructive attitudes and behaviors against Hindus and Hinduism. But what I want to talk about is there's external Hinduphobia, and then there's also what I'll call internal Hinduphobia, or how we become conditioned from within. And today I do want to focus on the American experience, but you cannot really talk about Hinduism without starting in India. And a lot of times when we talk about Hinduism or what's happening in Hindu society today, we just started in 1947, and we ignore history. And the fact is that for well over 1,000 years, India, and specifically Hindus, were the target of systemic invasions, murders, rapes, looting, and plunder of temples, and that is a part of the history. Along with that, there was a destruction of temples, and there was a dismantling of the traditional educational system. And we say education, it's not just education in terms of learning how to do what we need for our livelihood or for our careers, but learning our heritage, learning our culture, our religious principles, all of that. So like the Gurukula system was destroyed, universities were destroyed. And it got to the point where there's actually no Hindu studies program in India today. Until a few weeks ago, the BHU actually started the first Hindu studies program in India on a postgraduate basis. So if you just think about how incredible that is, and very sad that that's kind of the state that we've been reduced to. And what that has meant, though, is as a practical matter, we have been learning about who we are, what our beliefs are, what our traditions are from others, not from ourselves, because that ability to study and understand ourselves was taken away from us through colonialism in effect. And while many other countries around the world have gone through this, the sad part is that those local indigenous traditions have been totally destroyed and replaced by Christianity or Islam or other religions. And India and Hinduism are one of the very, very few places where we have held on to our indigenous systems and traditions to a certain extent. But this is the breadth of the challenge that we're facing. And what happens is when we're learning about ourselves from others, conditioning and biases and other things creep in, and it's not even necessarily intentional, but it just happens. And one of the great learning moments I had was when I was in high school. I was taking a class in AP European History, and the first day of class, the teacher asked us, okay, so you read the first chapter of this textbook, what do you think it means? And we all went around, we rattled off dates, and this king lived that long, and there was this war in such and such place. And she said, no, that's not the point. She said, you read the first chapter. What was the first chapter telling you? It wasn't telling you about a sequence of chronological events. It was telling you, and it had a thesis in it, and the thesis, and these were her words, is that if you want to succeed and thrive as a country in the modern world, then you should follow the Western model, which is based on a Protestant work ethic, which is based on democracy and type of government and economy that comes from Western Europe. And this book is saying that's the model that the entire world should follow. Those lines are not stated anywhere in the book, but that's the subtext, and that's when you read the story, that's when you read this history, that's what you come away with. And the reason that this was so important for me was not just for that history class, but to understand that whenever we read something or we watch something, we understand what is this trying to tell us and what is the meaning that they want us to take away from it. Because this is the kind of thing we are fed every day, and without realizing it, it shapes our beliefs and conceptions about all types of things. Another example of this, and there was a study on this in the media, which is for a long time when we talked about illegal immigrants, though, the wording that the media would use would be illegal aliens. And if you think about just what that word is, and we hear it so much that we kind of get numb to it, but to call someone an alien, and just all the connotations that come with that, it stands for something. Over the recent years, that's changed, and now we say like undocumented migrants. And if you think about illegal aliens versus undocumented migrants, factually they're describing the same thing, but they have very different meanings associated with them. And this is the subtle power of language, and this is what our teacher was trying to tell us. And so when we consume education of what Hinduism is from non-Hindus, even if they come at it with the best will in the world, it comes with all this conditioning and these biases, and we have to learn for ourselves to deconstruct that and decondition that. Then in addition, what we're kind of surrounded with is what we see in the media and movies and things like that. Some of you may be aware of like Temple of Doom, this Indiana Jones movie, and all the stereotypes that were in there. Even if you see things like Apu and The Simpsons or Big Bang Theory and how Indians are depicted, it's not flattering. I was just reading the other day, there's this game called Smite, so I guess it's this online game, and the characters in it are actually like Makali and Hanuman and other devas, and they're actually, the goal is to, you fight with these, with the devas, and you try to kill them, and they're basically just like characters in this game. And then when people tried to protest that this is very derogatory, they said, no, it's a cool thing. They have like this warrior spirit, that's great. And they said, well, why don't you use, like a Christian god or Islamic god or something? They said, well, no, that wouldn't be right. They're not as cool, and they're peaceful. And this is like a conversation that's happening now. So you kind of see all of this, all of these biases and things that are out there. And I had kind of gone through this when I was growing up here, and I remember when I was in high school, and another history teacher had come into the classroom, and he brought this newspaper, and there was like this article about this village and somewhere in like a remote part of India, and this plane had landed there, and the villagers saw this like white person who was the pilot, and then they were like garlanding him with flowers and things like that. And my teacher was just like laughing at this, and he was like, oh, isn't it hilarious? These people, they're so primitive, they don't even realize, and they're just like worshiping this person. And he didn't have the cultural context to understand that, no, that it wasn't about worshiping a person, but that's how you welcome someone or how you honor someone through this garlanding. But just I remember the feeling I had of embarrassment and humiliation, but also not knowing how to deal with that. And similar with other interactions with other teachers and professors. And it's really difficult for us because we are taught to revere and honor our teachers, and it's really difficult to challenge that. So when I was in a college class on Indian history, and my professor said, well, the Ramayana is really just about the Aryans taking over the Dravidians, and that's all that it is. I knew that it was wrong instinctively, but I didn't have a way of challenging him. And again, so there's kind of the sense of being stuck. And then the impact of that is that there is so much negative baggage loaded with the term of being Hindu or with Hinduism, that we often don't want to even use that word to describe ourselves. So it came out years ago that Yoga Journal actually put in writing that it never wanted to use the word Hindu in association with yoga because it just carried so much negative baggage. And so you see also this project of taking like the good things about Hinduism, like yoga and meditation, and stripping away from Hindu origins so that they don't have to deal with the baggage of it, and then just leave all the bad things to be associated with Hinduism. And so when that happens, you see like a lot of people who don't want to even call themselves Hindu, or the act of calling themselves Hindu is seen as being assertive or aggressive. Another thing that I think a lot about is, so when I do, like I have a shrine at home, and I have my puja vigrahas or murtis, and sometimes when I want to explain to someone, or if I'm writing an article, if I'm writing a story, and I want to translate it, and if I ever use the word idol, a lot of people, mostly Hindus and Indians, will get very upset. They'll say, well, it's just a bad word, you can't use that. The same if I use the word like polytheistic. And people say, no, that's terrible. If you read most articles or books about defining Hinduism, the first thing they'll say is we're not polytheistic. We believe in like one Brahman, and that's what we believe in. We're not polytheistic. We're not idol worshippers. What we do is different. And it's really interesting that we have this knee-jerk reaction, because what actually is wrong with being an idol worshiper, or what is wrong with being polytheistic? There's nothing wrong with it. And in fact, a lot of it, we do worship what are in fact idols. And I don't think there's any idol worshiper who didn't think there was some spirit behind the idol. And we do have, when we think of the family of Shiva and Parvati and Ganesh and Kartik, in a way that is a multiplicity of worship, or we have different days for worshiping different devas. That is multiplicity of worship. But we have this allergic reaction to even connecting ourselves with what were pagan traditions that were polytheistic, that were idol worshiping, because it has so much negative connotation because of this colonialist history. And in a way, the way we define ourselves is therefore being conditioned by that. The other part of that is mythology. So I wrote a novel about the Mahabharata, and when it goes into the classification, it'll be called mythological fiction. And a lot of Hindus, a lot of friends of mine I know, like, hate that term. And we hate that term because myth has come to mean fiction, or it's false, like, we're gonna be like a myth buster. But in reality, mythos, the Greek term, what it means, it has nothing to do with truth or falsity. It has to do with, it's a set of stories or cultural beliefs that are narrated through oral tradition that carry what a culture believes to be most important about itself. And that actually is exactly what our Itihasa is, that's what our Puranas are. It is mythos. It's not concerned with historical fact, but it's also not fiction. But again, we've become so conditioned by this that we just don't even want to be associated with words like mythology. And part of my hope is that we can reclaim those terms into their original meaning, which is different from the meaning that it's become associated through history. So one thing that happens is if someone says there's Hinduphobia, there are like a few reactions that tend to come, or some misconceptions. I'm not going to call them myths. One is, and actually I read this today on a website, well, Hindus are physically safe, so Hinduphobia isn't something real, it's not something you have to worry about. Actually, it's not, first of all, that's not true if you see what happened in Bangladesh or Pakistan. Hindus are not safe, they have not always been safe. But the second part of that is that it kind of goes into this idea that, well, you don't have to be oppressed by being Hindu, because you can just be something else. So in other words, if you can't really control your race, but you can control your religion. And so therefore, if you just did things to fit in better with the majoritarian or with the Western culture, you wouldn't have to worry about this. And therefore, Hinduphobia is kind of this luxurious problem to have, because it's about your religion, it's about spirituality, but you can have, you have the food you eat, you can have a career, you can have all these other things, you can pass. So this is just kind of like a privileged problem to have. And this is very insidious, because what it says is that we should only care about a superficial kind of diversity or inclusiveness. We don't have to care about religion, because you can just give that up, you can change that. We understand you can't change your race, and therefore we should care for that, but your religion is something you can change. And therefore Hinduphobia is kind of this problem we don't really have to worry about. And this is like a very insidious idea. And then this leads us to Hindutva. So you'll find that the very same people who say Hinduism doesn't really exist, Hinduphobia doesn't exist, but Hindutva, yes, that is very real. I also agree that Hindutva is very real, but, and this is where terminology matters and definitions matter, what do we mean when we say Hindutva? So let's start with, if you just look at etymology, so Hindutva is just Hindu plus Tattva. Tattva is like the ness of something. So if you have like white and whiteness, so like what does it mean to be a certain thing? It's the tattva of it, it's the essence of it. So literally, Hindutva means the essence of being Hindu. Etymologically, that's what it means. If you look at the history of it, and a lot of times Hindutva becomes very much associated with the BJP or the RSS or the Sangh. But actually, the first person to use the term Hindutva was not Savarkar. It was actually a person, Chandrakant Basu, in the 1800s, and it was just again about what does it mean to be Hindu. And what I would say is that you don't stop at Chandrakant Basu. Like if you're talking about what does it mean to be a Hindu in society, that goes all the way back to our rishis and acharyas. It goes back to people like Swami Vivekananda and Tagore and others who've been wrestling with this, with these questions of society and Hinduism and dharma. So if you just want to take the term on the face of it, that's all that it means, Hindutva. What does it mean to be Hindu? And it's the people who've been tackling this question. I also want to refer to a 1995 ruling from the Supreme Court of India, which gets into this point, because a lot of times what you hear when people argue about Hindutva as well is Hindutva is anti-minority rights. Hindutva is about extreme nationalism and fanaticism and things like that. So, and I'm quoting the Indian Supreme Court here. Considering the term Hinduism or Hindutva per se as depicting hostility, enmity, or intolerance towards other religions, faiths, or professing communalism proceeds from an improper appreciation and perception of the true meaning of these expressions. It is a fallacy and an error of law to proceed on the assumption that the use of words Hindutva or Hinduism per se depicts an attitude hostile to all persons practicing any religion other than the Hindu religion. So that's what the Supreme Court itself is saying. The other thing is that Hindutva is not party specific or policy specific. You can't find a manifesto or a mandate that spells out what Hindutva is. So for example, even though people would have you say, oh, it's this right-wing nationalism and that's what Hindutva is, there are actually very big differences between what some political parties or movements of the Sangh believe in and others believe in, when it comes to things like temple traditions and things like that, and when it comes to the role of caste or gender, there are schisms between what more traditionalists believe versus more of a grassroots organizations focused on nation building. So there isn't this monolith Hindutva ideology or faction or people, and this often gets really glossed over. So those are kind of the main terms I wanted to discuss, and then that all comes down to one question, which is, can Hinduism survive without Hindutva? And that's really the heart of what I want to talk about. The first aspect of it is semantic, which is what does it mean to have Hinduism without Hindutva? Because we kind of go back to this problem of definitions. Can a cow exist without cowness? So what exactly are we talking about? Assuming that you could theoretically split Hinduism from Hindutva, what would that mean? And this is where I think it becomes really pernicious, because I think in a lot of the discourse of what we're seeing today, Hindutva just becomes a convenient straw man. So we live in times where it's not really politically correct to come out and say something where you attack Hinduism as a religion of approximately 1 billion people. And so it's easier to say, well, I'm not anti-Hindu. I don't have a problem with Hinduism, but I have a problem with Hindutva. And then you can condemn things in the guise of Hindutva, which actually end up attacking Hinduism itself. And where this becomes problematic is people aren't saying, well, I disagree with this BJP policy, or I have a problem with this, this legislation. It's just Hindutva itself is a problem. And this becomes really a difference without a distinction. And I go back to, even if all the intentions are the best in the world, intentions do not always equal impact. So if you're talking to a regular person, and you may have come across this, right? People who say that, so you're Hindi, as if Hindi's a religion and not a language. If people cannot distinguish between Hindi and Hindu, then they're not going to be able to distinguish between Hindutva and Hindu. And so what ends up happening is when you end up vilifying Hindutva, that ends up painting Hinduism itself. And this makes Hindu itself a bad word, and just putting a thwa at the end of it doesn't really help. And I this reminds me of, there was a thing in on the 1800s where it was thuggies, or a sect of people who were lived on the outskirts of society, and they were like Makali worshippers or something, but this was like a small group of people, and they were kind of like outlaws. And they became like really vilified, and like the British came up with this a department. It was like a thuggy department to like eliminate the problem of thuggies, and that's from where we got this word thug. So again, it was this idea like taking something small and like making it into a convenient scapegoat and a villain, and using all of these superstitions with it, and that becomes really, really problematic. And then the other question comes, well, can we, so forgetting what others say, but when we think about ourselves, can we be Hindu without subscribing to Hindutva? So meaning, in the privacy of our own homes, we can practice our traditions, we can believe what we want to believe, but we will just abstain from Hindutva. And that's kind of what is being pushed nowadays. There are a few issues with this. First of all, that implicitly assumes that Hinduism has nothing to contribute to the public square. Meaning, when we're talking about things like policy or society building or culture building, there's nothing that Hinduism has to offer. And I find it hard to believe that with 5,000 years of history, with all the diversity of traditions and cultures within Hinduism, you look at Hinduism in Bali and other places, that there's nothing we have to offer the world in terms of thinking about what a state should look like, what governance should look like, what civilization should be. And this also relates to something I worked on when I was in college, which is I was studying international law, and I was studying Rwanda, and you may be aware that there was a terrible genocide in Rwanda in the 1990s. And the United Nations had set up like these international criminal tribunals to deal with the aftermath of the genocide. And when they were doing that and they established these courts, they were finding that it wasn't really working. It wasn't helping the people like move past the genocide or reconcile or things like that. And when people began to ask the local population, well, what would you find helpful? They didn't want those international law criminal tribunals. They wanted something that was called like gacaca courts, which are their own indigenous forms of justice. And it's not like a evidence-based litigious process like we're familiar with in Western law, but it's really about acknowledging truth. So like South Africa had Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. But it's basically the idea that you have this dialogue where the accused person is encouraged to really just kind of confess, and then that's the first start of rapprochement and moving on. And that's what they want, and that's what would have addressed their needs. But they couldn't find that in international law. And there's so many things that we've come to take for granted that, when it comes to democracy and secularism and international law and human rights, that those are the only ways we can think about those things. That the only way you can have inclusiveness is through secularism or other things. But that's not the reality of it. And part of Hindutva means contributing to that discussion and contributing to that discourse. So when I practice in law, there are countries that have laws around Sharia finance or Sharia banking, and those are accepted modes of actually transacting banking and things like that. So this idea that Hinduism or that other traditions outside the Western tradition have nothing to contribute is a wrong one. And if we really believe in multiculturalism and pluralism and democracy, then that means having full participation and full discussion. And the other part of it, I would say, is we cannot just escape the world. So you can't just ignore what's happening in the world. And this is the whole point of the Bhagavad Gita and Arjuna when he wants to lay down his arms and just go off and be a sadhu. You can't do that. You have to be concerned when there's injustice in the world or when the world is adharmic. You have to address that. And so therefore Hinduism does care about the world, and that again is a product of Hindutva. And then the last part of it is that Hinduism needs Hindutva to sustain itself. And there's this idea that politics, we want to stay away from politics, but politics matters and it's necessary. When you're in a democracy, representation matters, and every other community realizes this and in practice and acts on this basis. But we can't take for granted our ability to continue our traditions and practices, our ability to have power and protection within a system. And then for dharma itself to sustain, it needs an ecosystem. It needs, because dharma isn't like a book that you go and you read and okay, that's dharma. It's a living tradition that's based on transmission. So when it comes to the Vedas, there were shakas, and these shakas were just particular recensions or ways of reciting and understanding the Vedas that are passed down from generation to generation. Many of them have been completely lost. But if you don't have that ecosystem and that societal framework to nurture dharma, it can't survive. And Hindutva, again, is that ecosystem and that incubation. Is providing that space and support. I go back to sacred geography and this idea, some of you may be familiar in the life of Adi Shankara, and Adi Shankara was the one who said, karma yoga and rites and actions cannot lead us to moksha. But still, by the age of 32, he'd circumambulated India 4 times. When he had gone to Badrinath, in the river, and if any of you have been there, the river there is very rough, like huge waves, a bit strong currents, and there was the Vigraha of Narayan, Badri Narayan, was lost in the river, and he dove in, 3 times, risking his life before he took it out and put it back and reinstalled it in Badrinath. Why did he do that? Because specific things matter. So it's not that you just make a Vigraha of Narayan, it becomes destroyed and you can just sculpt another one. Because that specific Vigraha has vrittis and energy and tapobala in it. And that's where our strength and power comes from. So when a great Vedantin like Adi Shankara had that much Shraddha and love for this one particular piece of stone, then that shows you how much importance there is. Also, when he established Badrinath and Kedarnath, he established a system where the chief purohits for those temples would come from South India, and he was very particular about this. Why? Again, it's that sense of sacred geography of there being a unity and a cohesiveness, and of having that movement and that sense of identity. And so when we talk about sacred geography, things matter. Whatever you believe should have happened at Ayodhya, it is incontrovertible that as a Hindu, there is a pain when you have Ayodhya without Sri Rama in his home. Or as a Krishna Bhakta, when I went to Mathura, and there's a very, very small temple, and it's very obvious there, the destruction and everything that happened. You can have differences of view of what the resolution of that should be, or what we do with that today. But as a first step, the reality of that pain or the significance of sites of sacred geography to Hindus have to be acknowledged. And oftentimes it's just mocked or dismissed altogether, and that is not acceptable. And similarly, if you go to Kashi and the Vishwanath Mandir there is actually a Vigraha of Nandi, and Nandi's always facing Shiva, but you have this Nandi here where he's not facing Shiva because that original site of Shiva has been destroyed. And those things matter, and they're real, and they cause trauma, and they have to be addressed. And the legitimacy of that is that's what Hindutva, or the product of Hindutva, is about. And again, you can have differences in views of what the remediation or what the resolution is, but to care about that is not wrong, and for that to matter is not wrong. Also, a lot of Hinduism is based on our practices at home, what we actually do in our puja rooms and those traditions. And nowadays, it's really difficult to carry on those traditions without people feeling like it's backward and having a sense of guilt or shame about it. I remember, it was like in the summer, there was like a NASA internship program. Someone, like a Hindu girl, had been accepted, and she put up a picture, and in her picture she had like her altar behind her with her puja mandap with the vigrahas, and she got so much flack on social media for it. It was like really ugly to see. But this is where again, this is the sense of attack is very harmful. And a lot of times we see people who want to do like meditation and things like that because that's kind of cool, but like doing puja or things like that is considered primitive and backward. Caring about things like protection of cows is not a bad thing. If I wanted to eat dog meat here tomorrow, people would be offended by that. So it's not wrong for a culture, for a people to care about cows, to care about temples, temple traditions, and the abilities for temples to have their own traditions, and then their own education. So there have been many attempts, like at textbooks, and you can see the language in the textbooks where parents have wanted to go and just correct those. And even that has been met with like a lot of resistance. But these are the things that really matter. And if what we say when we say Hindutva means a public expression of Hinduism or having activism on these matters, then that is not only acceptable, but it's necessary for Hinduism to survive and adapt. I would say, I wear a bindi. I've worn a bindi ever since the first day I went to the office. And I remember, like, my mother was really worried. She's like, well, what are people going to say about you? And, you'll be perceived in all these different ways and things like that. And essentially, Hindutva is for any professing Hindu to be able to go to school, to work, out to society, and bring their full selves, bring their authentic selves. Like, just like it's important for a Muslim woman to be able to go out with a hijab and not feel censored for that. And these are really the types of things that we mean when we talk about Hindutva. And the final thing I want to say is that for those of us in America, we have a really singular opportunity, which is defining what it means to be Hindu in America. And it's going to be different, and the issues we deal with are going to be different from the issues in India. The opportunity is also different. There's a Buddhist teacher I know who he said, when he passed away like a decade ago, and he was saying what he's doing now is to set the stage for what happens to Buddhism in America 400 years from now. And when you think about it in that kind of scope of time, we're the ones who are really pioneering what Hindu identity, what the Hindu community, what Hinduism as it's practiced will be in this country. And that is an incredible opportunity. It's also an incredible responsibility. And what I really hope for is that we are able to have the space and the energy and the time to focus on those constructive things. On, how can we take this country, which is like our karma bhumi, and like contribute to it as Hindus and make things better and make our lives better, because Hinduism ultimately is for loka sangraha. This idea of Ritam is the loka sangraha, meaning the best for the well-being of all sentient beings, all life forms, not just us, and not just us as Hindus, but for the entire cosmos. And I hope that we're able to focus on those things which are constructive rather than having political and ideological and defensive battles all the time. That's why I think it is so important to have that space, the ability, and then the wherewithal to go about that project of defining ourselves, our identity, our roles, and who we want to be as a community, as a people, as a living tradition for the future. So those are really the thoughts I wanted to share, but I'd love to hear from you and have more of a dialogue. Thank you.
What's the name of the novel that you had written?
Oh, The Curse of Gandhari.
Would you be able to spell that last word?
Oh, sure. It's Gandhari. So it's about this queen whose story is told in the Mahabharata. So she gets married to a blind king, and then she blindfolds herself, and it's kind of a retelling of her story.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Aditi, we have a question online. So Akshara says Hinduism is a global minority and needs more solidarity than ever these times. What are some ways you will recommend to uphold Hindu Dharma and shun the falsehood created about Hinduism right now on the global front?
Yeah, so there are a number of elements to that. So one of the things is we tend to naturally, at least those of us who come from like the Indian background, we tend to ally ourselves like with linguistic groups, like regional groups or things like that, and not as consciously as a Hindu community. And so I think in other communities you find it's easier to do this, to have like a Muslim identity as well as a South Asian identity or whatever it may be. But there's been a reluctance, I think, to kind of have a Hindu identity, or like a Hindu American identity. I think for a lot of the reasons I was saying, but I think the more we take an interest in thinking of this Hindu community, not just like in the U.S. but worldwide, and then caring about what's happening, happening to Hindus like around the world. I think that's a first step, and then I think also just learning about Hinduism as practiced elsewhere and other traditions and things like that. But I think the first step is just having this identity, or just this consciousness that we are Hindu, and wherever we be in the world, we're facing certain challenges that are similar. We have this shared worldview and values, and then recognizing. It's to take pride. I don't mean like in a chauvinistic way, but understanding that there is something positive that Hinduism brings to us, and that is worth preserving. And I think sometimes for us it's even difficult just to get to that step. But once you know that, then you want to care for the community around the world, and you take an interest and invest it in that. So I think the more we can do to focus on that, it's really important.
We have another question online if anyone doesn't have it here. How do we get younger generations out of the inferior complex yeah, of being Indian and wanting to reject our identity in the favor of fitting into the white American culture?
Yes, I think Hinduism itself is so attractive. So I think sometimes it's just letting it speak for itself. So I don't know. I just think, when I read like the Mahabharata or the Puranas, there's so many like incredible stories that come from there. So like that's always drawn me. And I think sometimes we try a lot to explain Hinduism rather than helping people experience Hinduism. And I think because we're just like very intellectual, so we always try to like explain things, but it kind of gets in the way because it's experiential. So whether it's doing yoga or going to like a retreat where you do like japa, or learning or doing a small puja at home, those things really stay with you. And then I think it's engaging with the stories and like from the Puranas and the Itihas and the Mahabharata, and those things are so much more available today, even in English translations, than they were before. And I think the more that people experience that, the more it'll come to them. And sometimes things that you do in childhood, you only come back to them when you're an adult. So you may go to like a temple as a kid and you find it like really boring, but then like the practice of an arti stays with you. It's like when I was young, there were things I was interested in, but like Durga Puja was like, for me, it didn't really register. Like it's, but then when I was in college and like Durga Puja would come around, like I had like this nostalgia because I remember what it was like to go to like the high school auditorium, and there was like a big pandal there and then things like that. But the more you make those experiences part of a person's life, the more it'll stay with them. And then I think also being open to questioning. Questioning is a really good thing. There's a saying in Buddhism that the bigger the doubt, the bigger the realization. So when you're young, that's the time when you should be questioning and challenging things, and just allowing for that process is also really important.
I think Harsha just wanted to add to your point. She says, the thing is, so many Indian people may have ever even heard of Mahabharata, Ramayana, Vedas, etc. And then so many Indian guys specifically reject Indian culture. Feels like there's no coming back at that point.
part of it is, part of it takes time, right? So like I think, like when my parents' generation, like they came here, like they didn't teach us about like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana because they were very concerned with, security and building like a life for us and building like, like a career and things like that, and setting us up for to be well educated. And now I think we're kind of at this place where we have more of the luxury of going into these things. So part of it is as parents and as adults, like we have to learn it for ourselves before we can pass it on to others. And so I think in the past when you were in India, you could depend on a lot of things that was happening by osmosis. You were with your grandparents, you would pick things up, you didn't actually have to actively do things. It's kind of like, in the past you could have had like a very active lifestyle, so you didn't have to go to the gym, but now we're all like sitting at a desk, so you have to take the time to like exercise. So it's kind of like that, we have to take the time and effort to inculcate these learnings. But I think the good thing is like if you have like a Chinmaya mission or Balvihar, there are so many different resources now where you can go to like a Sunday school or like Balvihar or things like that and get this. It's easier now, so there are a lot more resources, so there's a lot more to do, but I think there are those opportunities and it's getting better. But part of it also is because we have so much of like this guilt and like this Hinduphobia within us that we don't even take the step of making sure that we're observing these things. And if we're not observing it, like our kids won't. Like I know when Shivratri comes and you're supposed to like fast the whole day and stay up the whole night. And so like I always take that day off at work. I know so many people say like, oh, like I wish I could take the day off, but like I have to work. And so if Shivratri really matters to you, then you'll explain to your boss that this is a religious holiday if you take that day off. And that's like the really great thing about the US, which is when we have that respect for ourselves and for our traditions, like everyone else will accommodate it and they'll welcome it and they'll be interested in it. But we have to start with that nishta and that importance for ourselves. But how can you expect a younger person to take Hinduism seriously if we're afraid to take a day off because what will our boss think?
Yeah, I think that's it for the online one, so you guys can continue.
Can I ask a personal question, if that's okay?
Sure.
Just curious, how do you balance the sort of full-time professional legal career and then doing this kind of civilizational, I don't know what you call it, type of work? So how does that, any tips or any insights that you can gain from that?
I think what I found is like you can't really manage time because like it's just impossible, but you kind of manage energy or it's kind of like if something is important to you, you'll somehow like the time will manifest around that. So there are times like work is just so intense and that has to be like the first priority. But if you're passionate about something, you'll find that time and it kind of comes. But a lot of it is also like prioritization. So understanding like you can't do so many things. Like for example, like writing is really important to me, and I wish I could have like more time just to write. But I know if I want to write, then I also won't be able to keep up with some of like some of my commitments like to friends or other things. I have to rearrange certain things. So I think in life, like on a given day, there's like one or two things you can do well like that day. And sometimes it's plotting out that, well, like today will be for work and writing, and then tomorrow I'm going to do this thing for dharma, and just being very intentional and clear about what your areas of priority are and which are the things you can let go of. A lot of us, we just end up spending a lot of times on things that are kind of like urgent but not important. So like this is something we actually were trained on at work, which is most people at work, they spend most of their day just on email. Because what will end up happening is you go through your email in the morning and then someone writes and then you respond to them and you kind of do that and it takes up all your time. And then the things that are really like value added are things where you're just like whiteboarding or you're thinking about something, but it's never urgent. Like no one's gonna ask you for that great, brilliant idea the next day. So we don't actually make time for that. But even if you just set aside like half an hour or an hour for that free thinking time, like that would be enough. Because like the rest of the day you may have to do like all this grunt work and emails and things like that, but having that 1 hour you'll get most of the benefit and impact and value add from that 1 hour. And the other thing you'll find is it gives you so much fulfillment and meaning that it makes the rest of it worthwhile. So that's how I kind of think about it. Like, I may not be able to do exactly what I want to do for like a full day, but if I just set aside that I know this 1 hour I'm gonna have for writing, or I want to read some text, or I want to do something, or for my sadhana, then it makes the rest of the day worthwhile. And then from that, like, suddenly you kind of find like time and opportunities manifest. So it's really understanding what is the thing that is important to you that, you know, like 10 years from now, you're gonna say, yes, that's what I wanted to do. This is what I wanted to spend my life on. And even if it's like an hour a week, even if it's like 5 hours a week, or it's an hour a day, whatever it is, that time, just like protect that and dedicate it to that. And then you'll see, first of all, it makes you happy and content. And then like over time, it may sound like a little bit hokey, but like the universe itself kind of adjusts around that to give you more time and ability to do those things.
Yeah, so just, I had a question about certain perspectives which are addressed in Hinduism. So is agnostic or atheistic perspectives also addressed in Hinduism? Or like, does it talk about atheistic or agnostic perspectives as well?
Yes, there are very much. So there's the Charvakas, and there's this idea of non-theistic Hinduism is very much there. Actually, like in the Mimamsa tradition, so when you look at like the Vedas, you have like the Karma Kanda, and then you have the Vedanta, like the Upanishads and the Vedanta. But like in Mimamsa, they actually say the Devatas are just come from like the mantras. So when you do like the mantras, like that's where the Devatas come from, but like they don't have like this separate kind of existence. So you can very much be a Hindu without without having a theistic orientation. So even in, you have like what you call like nirguna or sadguna. So sadguna is kind of what you consider like a Brahman with attributes. So if you have like Shiva or Devi or Vishnu, that's what would be a sadguna. And then nirguna is without attributes. So that's basically kind of like impersonal or a non-theistic orientation. So that very much is there as a valid, viable aspect of Hinduism. Which again is why it's really difficult when someone asks you what do Hindus believe in.
I'm not like sure how to phrase this yet because they're kind of two related questions that I want to ask, but I'm gonna just put
Sure.
together. A lot of people who like critique Hindutva or are kind of pushing for this more like domestic form of Hinduism where you're just like doing your puja and going about your day will always say that, oh, like Hinduism is very peace oriented, like ahimsa paramo dharma, like why get into all that when that's what this is really about. And a lot of times I think the example that comes to people's minds when they want to react to something like that, or if even they're on that side, is that moment in the Mahabharata where like Arjun has to decide whether or not he doesn't feel like fighting is the right thing to do, but at that point he has a Krishna there to like lay out his dharma for him, and then he goes forward. And that clarity just isn't there a lot of the time when people are taking this more like active Hindu stance, or like being active in their community from a place that is like grounded in what they believe is their dharma. So when it comes to dharma, there's first of all a feeling of like, oh, do I know what it is? Am I doing the right thing? And then also like being in contact with people who also feel that they're taking a very deeply Hindu stance that is very different from yours, which also feels equally grounded in like karmic thought. So when there's this like plurality in that, and then also this like orientation towards peace and harmony and equilibrium, how do we keep all of that in mind while also trying to maintain this activism that's grounded in Hinduism?
That's a really excellent question, and it's a really important one because one of the dangers is when you're kind of in polemical or these kinds of discussions, it's easy to lose sight of that. And you know, sometimes it's like Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, or the idea that the world is our family. This is like a very real one. It's not just like a platitude. In the Gita, the Krishna says that in whatever form one approaches me, in that form I come to them. And what this means, and some, you know, for a Hindu, it's very easy to accept the validity of other religious paths, and that is an important part of who we are. So for example, Swami Vivekananda said, the Hindu doesn't want that the Buddhist or the Christian should become a Hindu. The Hindu wants that the Hindu will become a better Hindu, the Christian will become a better Christian, the Buddhist will become a better Buddhist. And this is kind of the source of peacefulness or ability to coexist that is core to Hinduism. And if we were to lose that, then that would be a very terrible thing. Yes, where it becomes difficult is when you have that kind of orientation, but if you're in a situation where you may have respect for others, but others don't have that same accommodating spirit towards you, then you're kind of in this dilemma. And that was kind of the dilemma that Arjuna had. It was when he lays down his arms, it's not because he's afraid of fighting, it's because he doesn't want to take arms against his family, his teachers, his kinsmen. And this is a very, it's a very difficult issue. I think, you know, the Mahabharata itself is all about this kind of like karmic dilemmas and being pitted against these things. The issue is that if you're a sheep, it's easy to say everyone should be vegetarian. It doesn't matter unless you're actually the tiger who can actually, like, you know, choose what you eat. And so along with this idealism there has to be a very practical element of it. And there has to be this understanding that you can lay out this vision, and you can lay out this peacefulness and then this idealism when you have the power to actually implement it. So for example, you know, there are things like in the workplace, right? Like there are things that you see that aren't fair or that you wish you could change. But in reality, you have to deal with it the way it is, and then you hopefully get to a place where you're a manager or you're a leader, and you can make some of those changes. And the way I think about it is, I think it's actually illustrated beautifully in Krishna's life, right? So if you think of Krishna in Vraj with all of the gopis and the gopas and the cows and the deer, and it's a complete sattvic, peaceful, beautiful vision. Like, you know, what do you expect in like an Indian person's home, or like, you know, building those ties. But for the most part, we as a community haven't been great at that. When we do that, it's just very haphazard. So we don't have like a photo op or something, but we never ask for anything concrete in exchange. So that's as individuals, but I would say even as a community, like we don't have like, these are our top 3 foreign policy and domestic policy objectives as an Indian community or as a Hindu community, and therefore when you don't have that, you have no way of holding anyone to account because you don't have anything specific that you're asking for. And I think part of it is this, you know, unwillingness to adopt this identity, but then once we do adopt it, we're just not clear-headed enough in thinking these are the things that are important to us, and this is what we should be asking for. So I think a lot of it is having this just, you know, thinking through things like as a Hindu, what is the most important things to protect Hinduism or to protect the Hindu community or as Indians, but we don't really ask those questions, and I feel we're much more reactive than we are proactive. And also we tend to be like very personality kind of based. I find this even in India. Like I really hate the term like Modi Pak because I think it's a cheapening of the term Pak itself. But then a lot of it just turns out to be like personal, like, oh, I like Modi, and just because I like Modi, I'm just gonna like follow him. But you should have an agenda, like, well, if I care about India or if I care about Hinduism, like these are my actual policy goals and these are the things, but like we tend not to really think in those terms. And this kind of like lack of strategic thinking, I think is a big issue for us.
Yeah, I have a question, or just maybe a comment / question that's related to the previous two, which is, I don't know, looking at it from, I don't know, we don't live in India here, it's not super well studied on what's going on there, but it seems like there's like a deep identity crisis, which is underway, which is like there's a battle for defining what India is, what is India, right? And I don't know, maybe you know, like, is there some novel or something which lays out a vision of like what does the modern state that, like, I think about this movie Black Panther, for example, right? Totally mesmerized the whole culture because it displayed, I think, a civilization which was modern, fully modern, but had seamlessly integrated sort of indigenous culture. And there was like a modern indigenous civilization. People saw that and they were like, wow, right? And interestingly, in the plot of the story, it had to hide itself from the world because it felt the world wouldn't be able to handle it. And then at the end, it kind of like, okay, now we have to integrate it into the world community, right? So it's like, what is the vision of what this looks like? Because you know, what are you going to do? You're going to start teaching Arthashastra and all the economic classes, or are you going to start like doing Ashtanga yoga, you know, in all schools from the age of 5 and up? Like, what does this look like on the other side? I don't know if there's a clear vision for that. And then so some people feel like, okay, if we do this, if I'm not part of the Hindu community, then where do I go? You know, what's my place in this new society, right? So then they get freaked out. And then equivalently on the other side, is sort of so-called secular vision of India, which is maybe the other identity that's fighting for defining India. You know, the Hindu community feels like, you know, we feel like we don't really have, many people in the Hindu community feel like we really don't have a place in this vision of India. So what is the secular vision of India where we feel we're respected? So there's no clear vision on the other end of it. Like, what is this place going to look like? So do you have any thoughts on that? Like what would it look like on the other side if this sort of Hindutva essence sort of integrating more into a legitimately modern civilization? Because it can't just be about, you know, repairing the manders is important, I agree. But then what will the mandir look like of the 21st century, right? Like, do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There is one book I would recommend. It just came out. It's by J. Saidipag. It's called India That Is Bharat. He's a constitutional lawyer, and what he's done, and I haven't finished the book yet, but I've read a lot of it. What he really talks about is this idea of Bharat and India, and then the first part of it is like decolonialism, which is just this idea that we've been so shaped by colonialism that our very notions of what the Constitution is and our form of government is colored by this. And then so the first part is just understanding that, and then the second part is this project of then like reimagining what it could look like. And the answer is there isn't anything I think that's very good or complete or thorough in this. And the reason for, I mean, there is, like, if you go back to like the Mahabharata and the Puranas, like there's a whole section of the Mahabharata where Bhishma is on his a bed of arrows and he gives like discourses on Rajadharma and things like that. But to your point, like, you know, we don't live in a monarchy. We're not going back to like to a monarchy. So what do you do with assuming you have like a democracy or a republic, and how do you know? I think the question is, can you make a Hindu nation that is accommodative towards all faiths, but keep a modern state? So assume you have a democracy, you have like legal institutions, you have representative democracy, but then you allow there to be an expression of things that, you know, so for example, that Hindu temples would be run by Hindus or other things, or, you know, that kind of thing. That has not really been explored. I think even for people who call for like a Hindu Rashtra, like what does that really mean? You know, like people got freaked out by the idea like Manusmriti, for example. But the fact is, even in the ancient times, like people didn't keep a copy of Manusmriti at home, and Manusmriti wasn't really enforced publicly. It was more about a compilation of what what the observances and norms were. And a lot of it was like ritualistic. Like if you miss this observance, then here's a prayaschitta that you should do to make up for that. So I think it becomes kind of like this false fear. On the other hand, it is like a valid concern. But if you're starting from start, like, well, what does it look like? So if I'm a Muslim or a Christian, will I belong to this kind of like to a Hindu vision? And I think that it's very possible to have that. The issue is that we're not even allowed to have that conversation. We're not even allowed to have, like, imagine like a Black Panther kind of scenario, because as soon as you start going down that direction, you're stopped, and it's like, it's anti-minority, it's fascism, it's this, it's that, and then we're kind of like stuck, and so therefore we're just polarized between like two false choices. And I don't think it's either of those false choices. I think you have to allow for there to be this process of decolonializing ourselves and reimagining something that could be different. And I think there's a huge fear of anything being different, because what we consider like the West, which is like this tiny corner of the world. Like even when we do the globes, like Western Europe is so much more blown up in proportion than it actually is geographically. And from like 200 years of history, like that's it. But everyone's become accustomed to the idea like this is universalism. This is the solution to like every country's problems. And then you see what happens in Afghanistan. It's not. But we're so scared to ask, well, what could a different framework be? Because we're very colored by the history of what happened, like the World War and things like that. But if we don't ask that question, then we're going to be stuck with something. I don't think you can ever have like one model that works for everyone. I believe in multiple, like if you truly believe in multiplicity and pluralism, then you have to believe that there are different systems and different frameworks that could work. And the hope would be that in a global place, you can moderate for that and things like that. But you have to allow that project to happen. And right now, it's not being allowed to happen. But I think, so I think having that conversation, having that reimagination, but in a very realistic way. And part of that is others have to allow it to happen, but then part of it is on us, which is that we're not going back to like the Vedic ages. We're not going back. Sometimes it's there's this golden age of Hindu. I don't think there's a golden age, because if there truly was a golden age, we wouldn't be where we are today. If things were perfect, then other things wouldn't have happened that led to where we are today. So you can't look backward. And the whole idea of, when Krishna comes, he ushers in the Kali Yuga. He doesn't take us back to like Rama Rajya. So that means like it has to be different. We have to be forward looking. And there's so many great things from the West, from China, from different things that we should be accepting of and integrate and things like that. But right now we're not even equipped to start on that because either we have this inferiority complex or we have like chauvinism. And what we need is something that's like confidence, but yet still humble and willing to learn. And in the Vedas it says like, let noble thoughts come to us from all sides. And when you're actually confident and rooted, then you're very open to things. It's when you don't have that, when you have this insecurity, that you tend to be more closed-minded. And so there is this process, I think, that has to be gone through of decoloniality, awakening, and all of this. And what I really think is in India, it'll take much longer because there's so much of that history and that baggage. And I actually think for those of us in the US, we actually have a bit of a luxury of maybe starting a few steps ahead because we don't have to battle through a lot of things. And that's where I hope we can contribute. So I hope we can come up with, like our version of Black Panther and what it looks like and all these things. And I think it's starting, but it's starting really slow, and we need to accelerate it.
Yeah, it just seems like, I think that's a really good point. It's like there's a lack of a cohesive, positive vision, and so everyone's projecting their nightmares, and then social media amplifies.
Yeah. And it becomes really, and that's where I think, this constructive part, and this goes back to what you were asking about too, which is like this idealism part and this constructive part is really important, because if you're always just on the defensive, or if you're always in a victim mode, it's really bad. Like we should actually never be in a victim mode. because then what ends up happening is everything just becomes destructive. And so it always has to be constructive and thinking of like loka sangraha and not just, us as in a kind of tribalistic way. And I think that's really important. And part of what happens is on this discourse on Hindutva, because I think a lot of Hindus shy away from that because they don't want to be associated with that. So like I know when I was younger, I was like, oh, I don't want to be associated with the song or whatever before I understood things better. But the more that people hit it like that, the harder it becomes for others to come in and maybe change that vision and make it more like inclusive or accommodating or positive or whatever it is. So I think that's another problem that comes with the discourse.
I don't know how we are on time, but okay, cool. I wanted to keep going down this like Hindutva discussion, but I had like a kind of unrelated question that I guess I'll just ask now. I really liked and agreed with what you said about like mythology and like choosing our words in a kind of like as a reaction to like the ridicule that they receive in schools or in the U.S. So like mythology, idols, or I think you mentioned another one.
Polytheism.
Polytheism, that's right. And how we can kind of reclaim those words. I just kind of wanted to question that a little bit because while I agree that like the motivation behind that as a kind of like defense, how do we make ourselves like sound better to these people, is not the best way to like approach our ideas or reframe them, but I feel like a lot of good things came from that kind of rethinking, rewording, a lot of like kind of unifying different parts of Hinduism, not just like, oh, these people believe that, so they're very different, which I think kind of is a big issue a lot of times with more like traditional families where they sort of see their practice of Hinduism as being like distinct, more distinct than they are from just like general Hindu practices. Same goes for like understanding like the divinity, of like how we think about divinity in idol worship, or why we want to call something a murti or like push forward Sanskrit terms, and with mythology and polytheism also this idea of like Atman. I don't think people really like talked about Atman, Brahman, Paramatma, things like that until that became such a big talking point in schools or in like rethinking how textbooks should be formatted. So it's not really questioned, but I wonder if there's a way to do away with this like very reactive approach to re-understanding our own ideas and values while still maintaining this kind of like going back, rethinking, rewording, and like how to, I guess at the core of this question is like how can we maintain like the pros of being active like this without drawing it from like a reactive motivation.
Yeah, so I think it's like a pendulum, right? So it's bad if you really just want to conform to what another person is and you want them to accept you, so you just say like, well, I'm just like you and I also just worship just one God. Like that's bad. It's equally bad if you say, well, I just want to show like how different I am, and so like I'm just going to focus on all these things that are so different. I think in reality it becomes a bit of both. So like there is this whole thing, you mentioned this something like Sanskrit, like non-translatables, and there's a book that came out by Banerjee, and there too it's a balance, right? Because on the one hand you do want to keep the words like dharma or atman that aren't easily translated, and you want to preserve those terms and preserve the authenticity that comes with it. On the other hand, language is all about communication. So if I were just to speak like 10 words of Sanskrit to someone, they're not going to understand what I mean. And I risk losing out a potential connection. I risk losing the ability to convey what I am. And so this is actually something I deal a lot with when I write fiction. I write my stories, right? So like I don't want to write the word God, so I'll use the word like Deva. But if I just use the word Deva, like no one's going to understand it. And when you're writing a novel, I can't have like a long glossary. It would have like a paragraph on like the events and things like that. And so I actually, what I do, and I work with like a writing coach, and he says like, you know, and he's not Hindu, he's not of Indian origin. And he says like, you know, I love foreign languages, but I also want to like, I want to like learn them like in an organic way. So like, for example, if I wanted to use the word like khichdi, I'd say like, you know, like I made my khichdi and like the lentil and rice porridge like tasted good or something like that. So you find ways of using the term and then kind of explaining what it is. And so that way the person can understand, like the third time you use the word khichdi, like they understand what you're saying. At the same time, you know, like sometimes I have to use the word gods or God, because it just, if you're always just using, you know, like the pure pristine form of the word, then you're losing out on something. And so it's always, I think of it as kind of like a pendulum, and you have to kind of think about it both ways. So sometimes, and I think this actually is a good principle in general, which is when you're having a conversation with someone, or if you're having like a debate or a discussion and they say something, think about all the ways that you agree with it, and then think about all the ways in which there could be like a distinction, or you can push back against it. And that's actually what makes it like a true exchange, and not just like, you know, and not like adversarial, because it's not about like winning or something, but it's about like really taking a proposition and like understanding it from all angles. And I think that is constructive. So I think there's something that's interesting, even if you're to come at something and say, well, what is wrong with polytheism, and to have that I think there's something interesting in it. But then I think there's also interesting in saying, well, okay, like if I have this polytheistic aspect, but then there's this other aspect which may be, you know, like closer to some of, you know, like Christian mysticism or things like that. And there is that is also there. So I think it's doing both. But I think the more we're secure in who we are, it just happens naturally and organically. But right now, when we have this inferiority complex, or we have these issues with being different, then we're just not able to do it in a healthy way. But I think once you have that, it's much easier. You know, like if you have like a tree that's like deeply rooted, its branches can spread out wide. And so I think that's what it is. Like you want to root deeply, but then you also want to go wide. So that's kind of how I would think about it. So yeah, I agree. Like it's not just, you want to generate light and not heat. That's kind of the goal of it.
Like with the, thank you for your time today. With the new, like the OIT theory that has been proved by genetics, the Out of India art theory, how do you think like it'll promote Hindutva, or like there'll always be like the AIT Christian fanatics still saying it's a Hindutva fantasy?
So there are many people who are much better suited to speak to this than I am, because there's so much thing on, like, there's genetics, there's the DNA, there's like linguistics, like all these like aspects to it, and I don't fully follow all of it. I think this is like another interesting thing, this obsession with the OIT and AIT. I think what is important is like AIT was obviously very much driven by the colonialists as a way of showing that nothing good could have come out of India or Hinduism, and that needs to be debunked. My sense of it is that it's probably never going to, maybe I shouldn't say never, but it's hard to definitively say AIT versus OIT, and the, you know, this is hard to probably pinpoint it, and we may not be able to get to that level of certainty. I think the way I think about it is we should have that, continue to have that research and that exploration and like all those discussions about it. But one way or the other, I feel at the end of the day, our ancestors who preserved Dharma, preserved the Vedas and things like that, they are our ancestors, and whatever that historical fact may have been doesn't change the validity of who we are as a people, or the indigeneity of our traditions. But I think there's still work going on. I think what's important is that OIT should be given its space, and the scholars who are working on it should have the ability to continue that scholarship and share that scholarship and have an equal platform and space. And I think that's important. We should continue to fight for that. And people should continue to do that research. But that's kind of my view on it.
You feel like the history courses will get edited in the universities?
The history was
The
what?
history courses will start teaching the right thing?
I think we have to fight a lot harder before that happens.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask a question, particularly because when I came here today, particularly about the topic, as somebody who kind of watches the news, I'm like, man, the same biases that you explained that most people have about Hindu nationalism, I particularly came in with the same ideologies myself and thinking, you know what, that's probably what it is. But based on what you said, there's a lot more information that I felt that I particularly don't know. And as somebody who's read the Bhagavad Gita, I've been very interested in learning about the Hindu religion. I had hoped that I had a firm understanding of the religion itself. But for somebody who's trying to understand it, what would you recommend is maybe some good resources for them to, expand their knowledge on it?
So there are books. So I guess it depends on whether it's like you mean like the philosophical aspects of it or.
Even the terms, a lot of the terms you use, like went right over my head. I think Puja's probably the only one I knew, and mandir is similar to a church worshiping place. But other than that, a lot of the terms I'm like, hey, I don't think I really know that. And I wanted to ask maybe where can I kind of try and understand these kind of things? Where can I go to kind of understand these?
So I always think of like the Bhagavad Gita as being like a good place to start. There's some good English translations like Swami Shivananda's, which is like freely available online as a PDF. That really expounds kind of the core philosophy and messages. There is a book on actually Linda Johnson has, which is like the Idiot's Guide to Hinduism, which it sounds silly, but it's actually like a really good book that gives like a good overview of it and it's very balanced. That's actually like a very good overview. There's also a book by like Klaus Klostermaier on Hinduism, which again is a bit more academic. Then there are other, so those are some to kind of start with.
Okay, thank you.
And I can like text you the names or something if that'd be helpful.
That would be dope. Yeah, I'll stay after.
Awesome. Thank you, Aditi, for coming out and speaking on this very important topic. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here tonight. For those of you that did come to our Ganesh Utsav, we hope you did have a good time here at our second event. And for those of you who's coming for the first time, we do hope that you did learn more about the organization and had a very good time as well. Please do follow us on our social medias, Instagram at Hinduva, Facebook at Rutgers Hinduva, as we do have an upcoming event at the end of this month and a couple of general meetings next month. So we will be updating stuff on our social media in the coming weeks. If you do have any questions about the organization, I'm more than happy to answer, and anyone with the blue or maroon Hinduva shirt will be more than happy to answer. If you do have any more questions for Aditi, I'm sure she's more than willing to help you answer. But this does mark the end of our event, and thank you.